All right, let's hit some terminology in here. Let's talk about some of the definitions that you're going to find in this chapter. The first thing I'm going to talk about is what a cost object is. The costs that we're going to be working with are going to be classified depending on the cost object that we're using to look at the items. So depending on what the cost object is, costs related to that cost object can either be direct or indirect. I know that sounds a little confusing. So let's talk about this as an example. Let's use an example. Let's say you're building, what you do in your business is you make jungle gyms, right, for children to play on. And the jungle gym is your cost object. And you're trying to decide whether or not costs are direct costs or indirect costs for that jungle gym. Now, direct costs are those costs that go directly to the product that is, well, to the cost object. So think of what a direct cost might be for a jungle gym. You might say nails, wood, rope, right, the slides that are on it, any of those type of things. Those would be direct costs of the jungle gym, as well as maybe even the salary of the person that's assembling the jungle gym. That would also be a direct cost. That would be a direct labor cost, whereas direct materials costs would be, like I said, the salary, the wood, the rope, and so on, and the nails and whatnot. All right. What are indirect costs? Maybe the indirect cost of that jungle gym would be the salary of the person in charge of the factory, okay, the factory that makes them. Now the thing is the person that is in charge of the factory, his hands are not actually on the jungle gym turning the screws, assembling the pieces. He's in charge of the overall process of getting the jungle gyms put together and shipped out the door. So the thing is, if the jungle gym is your cost object, then the direct materials I've already noted, and the direct labor I've already noted, and factory overhead, we're going to talk about that in a minute. That's your indirect cost. Let's change our perspective now. Let's say that the overall process of creating jungle gyms in this factory is our cost object, and we're trying to look at the process. If that was the case, then the salary of that supervisor would be a direct cost because he is part of the whole process. So it's really about the perspective that you're using as to whether or not something would be a direct or an indirect cost. All right, so we talked about, you can have some, I'm sure you can read some other examples in your book. Okay, so let's talk about what each of these are. We just mentioned direct materials and we mentioned direct labor. Direct materials are the items that go directly into whatever the product you're making is. All right. Direct labor costs would be the actual people with their hands on the product making it, putting it together. Factory overhead costs. Factory overhead costs is pretty much almost everything else that has to do with the production process or whatever you're making, putting together the object of whatever you're making. So let's say you're in a factory and you're putting together these jungle gyms. The factory is going to have a lot of costs. You're going to have property taxes that you have to pay on that factory. You might have mortgage that you have to pay on that factory. You might have to pay for electricity for that factory. I would assume you would. Let's see, again, something like the supervisor's salary. All of these things don't have anything to do with the product directly that you're making, but you do need them in order to build the product. Well, those items are listed as indirect costs, and they really are called factory overhead costs. They're all the things you would need in order to create the product, but that aren't directly related to the product. Okay, you get the idea here? Like I said, electricity, water, bills, things like that. Sorry, I just heard something crash from my downstairs. Alright, I'm not going to rewind. We'll just keep going. So, factory overhead costs are typically indirect costs because they don't have anything to do with the product that you're making directly. Alright, so let's talk about prime cost versus conversion costs. You can look at these things two ways. Direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead we're going to be talking about a lot throughout the rest of, pretty much the rest of the semester. Prime costs are those costs, the main costs that you would have in relation to building the product. So prime costs are actually direct materials and direct labor, and you look at the two of those together. They're the prime costs with building the whatever product you're making. Conversion costs are direct labor costs and factory overhead costs together. So yes, direct labor goes into both of these items. But factory overhead costs conversion costs include factory overhead and labor, because you need those items in order to convert something from a raw material into a finished product. All right, so those are considered conversion costs. All of these items are also considered to be product costs: direct materials, direct labor, factory overhead. They're all a cost of creating the product. Like, you couldn't create the jungle gym without the wood, you couldn't create it without the salary of the laborer putting it together, and you couldn't put it together without the property taxes you had to pay on the building and the electricity you had to pay on the building. All of those items together get combined into what is called the product cost. And they all, well, we'll talk about it in a few minutes, but they all become costs of the product ultimately, whatever it is that you're making. Period costs are really kind of selling and administrative costs. So period costs are those that go directly to the income statement, and they do not become part of the cost of the product. So period cost, an example of that might be the cost of the administrative assistant who works for the CEO, his salary also. The CEO's salary is considered a period cost because it doesn't have anything to do with actually making the product. So let's just say you built a ton of jungle gyms, and you've got several factories that build them. But maybe also you have a headquarters office that sole purpose is to run the business and not actually make any jungle gyms themselves. Well, the cost of that head office that wouldn't actually make any of the products, the cost of running that office would be a period cost. They don't add to the cost of the product in any way. Okay. Now, on the balance sheet in a manufacturing business, which, as I said, is pretty much where our main focus is going to be, on the balance sheet, you don't just have inventory anymore. What you guys have been used to seeing through financial accounting is just one class of inventory. Well, now we're going to have several classes of inventory for a manufacturing company. The classes of inventory are raw materials, and pretty much raw materials are those materials that might be sitting on your shelves untouched, ready to go into production to produce your jungle gym or whatever it is that you're making. You also have another category called work in process, and you also refer to this as WIP. The work in process inventory is inventory that is currently out there on your production floor, has been pulled out of raw materials inventory, and is being currently worked on. All right? It's not like at the end of the month we stop everything and we say, okay, let's finish everything up, and then we have a clean slate to start from. Right? At all times, you constantly have inventory being worked on and products being made. So you have raw materials, which is untouched. You've got work in process or WIP inventory. And when you're finally done with whatever it is that you're making, jungle gyms or whatever product you decide we're going to make, the item that we're finished with goes into what is called our finished goods inventory. And they're sitting on the shelves waiting to be sold, basically. All right. So what happens here is when you sell these items, when you sell something out of finished goods inventory, it then goes over to the income statement as cost of goods manufactured. Okay, if you reach way back in your memory, you might remember it's sales minus cost of goods manufactured gives you gross profit. That's the beginning of any income statement. Okay, so when a product moves out of finished goods inventory, when it gets sold, it shows up on the income statement as cost of goods manufactured. I like this slide because it's a little bit of a visual of exactly what I just talked about. Here, what you've got your classes of inventory here, your raw materials, work in process, and finished goods. So you've got your direct materials, right? And this is the stuff that comes in off the floor, that's not off the floor, but off of the shelves, brand new stuff. And you've got materials inventory that maybe hasn't even been touched yet, that's unused. But once you use it, it goes in the manufacturing process, right? You're working on it, it's out there on the floor, everybody's, hammers and nails are going, and it's being worked on, those materials. And if they're still unfinished at the end of the month, that goes into our work in process inventory. Now, there's other things that go into any product, right? We were talking about this before. Direct materials go into any product that's being worked on. Direct labor also goes into the product that's being worked on. And factory overhead also goes into the product that's being worked on. You look at all three of those items together to come up with what our work in process inventory is. Once we're finished with the whatever our product is, it goes in the finished goods inventory, and then when we sell it, it goes in the income statement as cost of goods sold.